Steven Hartov, welcome to Suit Up the Podcast.
Did you inviting me, and I appreciate being here and looking forward to it.
For those that can't see, because obviously we have our listeners, and then we've got this on YouTube, but you are wearing a fantastic commando sweater, which gives me No Time to Die vibes from the latest James Bond film. So kudos to you.
Thank you very much. And you look absolutely sartorial yourself.
Thank you.
So
I'll admit, this is one of my favorite ties.
We're wearing Bondian outfits.
Hey, you know what? Patron saint of this podcast is James Bond, even though we've changed our logo to be the Indiana Jones guy right now. If Indiana Jones and James Bond had a love child, that would be what this show is supposed to be about.
I got it. All right. I'm in.
Well, first and foremost, I have to say, so reading over your biography sounds like the backstory to a thriller character. Like if you were designing someone for a story, you have been in the Merchant Marines, the Israeli Defense Force, intelligence work, and the New York Guard. Just tell me, how did that all come about?
Wow. Well, I think probably folks like us do too much thriller reading when we're kids. So, I mean, obviously I'm quite a bit older than you are, but when I was a kid, my mother in particular thrust all sorts of literary and not so literary works on me when I was very young. And I remember that the first adult book, other than the Hardy Boys, was The Guns of Navarone.
Very nice.
An Alistair MacLean book. And I think between that and as I grew older, reading an awful lot of Hemingway and all the greats of that time, post-World War II, Norman Mailer and all those things, I think I got the sense of adventure sort of, was sort of inserted into my soul. And then, of course, I had my own motivations for doing these things. I was halfway through college when I decided I couldn't sit in a classroom anymore, and I took off and joined the Merchant Marine because I wanted to see the world. And that went on for about a year. And then I thought, well, maybe I should get this degree, finish it. I came back, I finished
Minor details.
I took off again, and that's when I wound up in the IDF. I had family in Israel. Was very attached to that country. And at the time, foreigners did not do that much. There were only 2 Americans in my entire battalion, I think, or maybe in the entire brigade. And but it was sort of like joining the Foreign Legion.
That's what it made me think of when I heard your story. I'm like, this really does feel like a 1930s era, 1910s, that age of adventure stretch where you're joining like the French Foreign Legion.
That's pretty much what it was like. And back in the 70s, 1970s, when I joined the IDF, Israel was always back then, the country was always technologically behind the United States by 20 years.
Oh.
So
it was like being thrust into the 50s.
Yes, basically. And I mean, just to get a telephone in an apartment, you would wait 6 months, a landline. There were obviously no cell phones. There were no color televisions. I mean, it was, and the base that I, as a paratrooper, operated out of was a former British Army and then a Syrian Army base. So, and it was Foreign Legion to the max. So thereafter, I did reserve duty there for a long time also. I was a paratrooper. I was in special operations and so forth. And then eventually, when I came back to the States and started writing seriously, after 9/11, like many old soldiers, I had to, somehow get back in the fight. So I joined the New York Guard, and I was there for like 17 years. I just retired as a major a couple of years ago.
Wow, congratulations.
Well, thank you. I made it. But, some of us always have to put on a uniform. I don't know. It's just, let's see.
I mean, I will never deny there's definitely the coolness factor. I have often joked, so I'm an organic inspector as my regular job. And I've asked him, like, why don't we have like some kind of uniform thing, a patch, or just something cool? To date, no one has taken my plumed hat recommendation seriously.
How about a badge? Do you have a leather badge carrier that you can,
So
bring
cool.
on someone?
That's what I should have been campaigning for.
Yes. Yes. Just
So
flash the badge,
yeah,
and that's all you need.
I can, hey, I am willing to do 1930s, 40s noir cop. I've got my trench coat already. I've got the fedora, two color fedoras, because of course you need one for one weather, one for the other.
Right.
When did you decide you wanted to seriously start pursuing writing?
I actually went to Boston University to theater school. But there was something about it. I got the sense right away that I would not really fit in that community of pretend,
Mm-hmm.
if you know what I mean. And I had always been a writer, just doodling, and a reader of all sort of voracious reader. And I think when I was in the actually, when I was in the Merchant Marine, I started taking my first notes, serious notes about that sort of thing. But when I was in the Israeli army, whenever I would get a chance, which wasn't often, I would, if I got leave for a weekend, I would Hemingway it and wind up sitting in a cafe in Jerusalem someplace, scribbling in a notebook with my uniform on and my submachine gun, propped against a chair. That was my thing. And by the time when I came back from a stint in Lebanon in 1983 was when I seriously started my first novel. So I was 30.
Mm-hmm. And you had life under your belt to talk about, which I think that is the thing. I had this conversation with a recent show guest, Tony O'Neill, that
Yes.
a lot of young writers, you can teach someone how to write, but if they don't have something to say, or they don't know how to have stories to tell, it's kind of a waste. It's like seeing something. I'm gonna offend some people. I don't know how you feel about AI art, but that's actually a good like comparison because there isn't really much soul to it. You can see that it's a thing,
I totally agree.
but it doesn't have that zest, that thing that animates it.
No, it can't possibly. And I completely, we're of the same mind when it comes to writing. They say write what you know. Well, if you haven't been anywhere or done anything, what do you know? So you can fantasize, or you can do a lot of research online, or you can read somebody else's work, and sometimes you can make a fairly good approximation of, for example, Paris in 1923.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't go back to Paris in 1923, but you can go to Paris.
Yeah.
And not everybody can afford to do that. But then if you're writing a smaller mystery about, let's say you live in New Jersey and you can't afford to go anywhere really, but you can sure as hell write a great noir thriller about New York City. It's right over the bridge. Yeah. So I'm with you on that.
I had recently reread, because doing this show, I read a lot of garbage books, the good kind of garbage and the bad kind of garbage. I recently read one of the bad kinds, and I was just reminded, oh, that's right. This is what those early attempts often are when you're trying to make something someone else has made, your version of it, without like your own thing thrown in there. It's just the pastiche, not the making its own thing.
Yes.
And I actually, when I was looking over your stuff, I was thinking, this reminds me a lot of Jack London and Ernest Hemingway, because obviously both of them are like I think like London now is kind of overshadowed by Hemingway's legacy, but he was that proto version of, I mean, he went to the Klondike. He was a pirate, basically, and then joined the pirate Coast Guard scuttle service, basically. Incredible life experiences before he then sat down and wrote. And that's why some of his stuff is just amazing, because he did all these things.
I think you can't really get. Yes, he was incredible. He was even more adventurous than Hemingway. Hemingway, it seems to me, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Hemingway. I've read every word he ever wrote. I mean, I know he was.
Which is your favorite?
Oh God. I love To Have and Have Not. I love For Whom the Bell Tolls.
To Have and Have Not was pretty ranked low by Hemingway, wasn't it?
Yes.
The
Yes.
reason I remember this is because I watched the film version recently, and it was like a bet between Hemingway and the director. The director said, "I can make your worst book an incredible film,"
And he
and
did.
he did. And because Bogey and Bacall, that's
yes, of
the
course.
iconic.
But I think that book, I love that book because it is so raw.
Mm.
It's not, very sophisticated plot wise, and it's not very sophisticated in terms of some of his other more romantic considerations like A Farewell to Arms and so forth. But it's just Hemingway bleeding on the page, which I really love. So I I think a lot of these guys and gals. Have you ever read Beryl Markham, West with the Night?
No.
Oh, you've got to get a hold of this. This is Beryl Markham's West with the Night. Now, Hemingway was actually envious of her skill. And she's a magnificent writer. And she was a bush pilot. And we're talking, out of Africa stuff.
Uh-huh.
It's magnificent.
What you're describing is my bread and butter, so I cannot wait to read this.
No, it's a fabulous book. I think I've bought 8 copies of it to give away to people, including lots of female pilots that I give it to as a gift.
Oh, that's so cool.
These people, and that's where I learned, and probably you did as well, my theory of if you're going to write something true, and you're going to have your readers feel it and smell it and get up from their chairs feeling as though they have actually been to that place, you have to have done that too, because you just can't make that stuff up. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I was reading Matt Bird. He's written 2 books, Secrets of Story, Secrets of Character, for Writer's Digest, and fantastic books. He makes a comment: you don't necessarily have to write what you know, but you have to write what you know how to describe and feel, because that's what people connect to, is that feeling that they're getting when they're reading it. Yes. If you can't properly articulate what that concept is, then it's not going to connect with the audience unless you know what that feeling is, unless you're able to put that emotion, that raw id bits onto the page in a way that works. It falls flat.
But that's also the skill of being able to do that. It takes writers a long time to learn how to not describe it.
Yes.
But organically relay it. Sometimes there's no more than a word.
Well, and that's the beauty of like Hemingway. And I'd say with your writing too, is it's knowing how not to take more time than necessary to say the thing. Know how to say what's important in the least amount of words possible. Don't use the 4 words when 3 words will do, kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I'm a fan of that theory. Obviously, and sometimes there's an issue with younger writers and their lack of patience, where one might think that being more having a terser writing style would appeal to them, but it doesn't. It's like lots of readers now want to be spoon-fed the emotions.
Yeah. Rather than having to actually, this is the subtext. Yes. Unless there's subtext there, it's actually Hemingway's iceberg theory is the example of this. Being able to have so much beneath the surface. That short story, is it White Elephants or the Hills of Kilimanjaro?
Which one?
The one where they have an entire conversation about whether or not she's going to have an abortion.
I think it's Kilimanjaro.
But it's never said. It's such a pristine example of what it means to have subtext in the conversation, where throughout you're slowly uncovering what they're actually not talking about. Okay,
but I have a question about that, Terrence. Do you think that was because he was doing that he was trying to do it artfully, or was it that at the time you couldn't discuss abortion on a literary page?
I think that it is an interesting example of how when creative people are put under restrictions, they're more
They'll do it
innovative.
anyway. They'll do it anyway, right?
Yeah, well, it's like the old code movies. How many great movies do we have because they had to be clever about how they discuss things? There's a 1950s film. It's not like great art by any stretch, but it's a bedroom drama that's based on the. Are you familiar with the Line Engine Ant story?
No.
So it was the short story that became a radio program that was like popular in the 50s, where this plantation is overrun by killer ants, fire ants. They're going to destroy everything. They made a film of this starring Charlton Heston. Here's the thing. That whole ant thing is only like half the last final climax of the film. Most of that film is about how he is upset at the fact that a previously married woman is his mail order bride. This is set in like late Victorian era. So the entire film is basically about the fact he's a virgin, she's not. And they can't say any of that.
Yes, right.
But because their interactions are just so charged, they made an entire film about sex without actually talking about it.
What's the name of it?
It's called The Naked Jungle.
Oh, yeah. I know the title.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal film. Like,
I'll have to watch it again.
Well worth it, if for no other reason than because Charlton Heston is just incredible. Chewing the scenery.
I'll have to watch that again. I haven't seen that in years and years and years and don't really remember it, but I remember the title, of course.
It's one of those titles that definitely sticks with you. I mean, they figured out what sold, even if they couldn't talk about it.
You know, there's another film like that I saw recently in which they were dancing around a lot of the meanings. Night of the Iguana, Richard Burton.
Oh, yes. I've heard about that, but I have never seen it.
Oh, it's fabulous.
I mean, anything with Richard Burton in it.
Yeah, anything with Richard Burton. Like, he can read the phone book. It doesn't matter. It's a great film. You should check it out. It's really wonderful. And it has, what is that actress's name? I can't think of it right now. She was Austrian born. Hedy Lamarr.
Ooh, oh, I'm even more interested now.
Yeah, I think it's Hedy Lamarr. Is it Hedy Lamarr was in it? I think. I'm not sure. We'll have to check it out. But it's a great film. And also dancing around morality issues and not really talking about the fact that the priest is having an affair with some of his younger constituents. And it's, yeah, it's really good.
Just again, having that subtlety, that subtext fuels a more interesting story by and large. And most younger writers, I mean, I'll throw myself in that category because I've written one book, technically 2 books, working on my 3rd one. And that has been the thing that I have to remind myself, okay, what am I making explicit that I can make it more underneath the surface? How do I make it more subtle and more entertaining?
It's hard. So what are you writing now, Terrence? What?
Right now, I'm finishing up my sequel to my first romance novel. My middle book that is with a publisher right now is a pulp adventure story.
Nice.
That's the one that I'm hoping to transition my career more towards. For whatever reason, romance novel, it was fun, but not my thing.
And how did you come to write the romance novel? I did read about that on your site, but I was kind of interested to hear how you got into that genre.
I love Jane Austen. I think that pound for pound dialogue in Emma and Pride and Prejudice are nearly unparalleled. Like, it's what if Elmore Leonard wrote a romance novel? Is essentially what those books are. But I wanted to, it started as a joke. What would a romance novel from like Jane Austen type thing sound like from a dude's perspective? And so I made the main thrust of the character in the first book a dude. And it's entertaining, and I used a lot of the things that I have come across just with my friends and interactions for that book because I thought it was fun, and it was me using some of those life experiences. I had no intention of writing fiction ever. I thought I was going to do nonfiction, but then I wrote that and I found I really liked it.
That's awesome. And the pulp fiction book that you've written?
It's called One Man's Treasure. Very excited for it. I'll tell you more about after the recording, so as not to give too many spoilers since it's got an yet undisclosed release date, but excited about it.
Very nice. I look forward to reading it.
Getting back to your book, The Last of the Seven. Tell me, how did this come about? Because first and foremost, could you explain to the audience just a brief synopsis? and then tell me where you came up with this story, because it's amazing.
When I was young, we're talking many years ago, when I was, you know, a young Israeli paratrooper, I met a number of these men who had been British commandos during World War II. They were all
Oh,
Jews, of
wow.
course. And they were Jews, and they had come from Austria or Germany, and they had fought in North Africa, or they had fought in Europe. And they had joined the British Army after having been pretty much orphaned by the Nazis.
Yeah.
So I was fascinated by these very outrageously courageous young commandos from that period, and they had raided Tobruk, and you know, it was a very small group, and there were only a few of them left. Now, many years later, I wrote a book called The Soul of a Thief.
Mm-hmm.
And The Soul of a Thief, this book, that book, The Soul of a Thief, is a story about a young Austrian 19-year-old conscript in the German army in World War II in France. And he's a Mischling, which is a mixed Christian and Jewish. And he winds up in the clutches of an SS colonel working for him as an adjutant in France during World War II, right on the cusp of the Normandy invasion. And the two of them fall in love with the same young French nurse, and hijinks ensue. But it's an adventure, and it was based on a great uncle of mine. I mean, he was the primary figure that inspired this. This great uncle of mine was an Austrian kid, also 19 years old, also a Mischling, who thought that his best bet to survive the Nazi regime was to join the Luftwaffe. Which he did. Yeah, which he did. And I'm sure he wasn't circumcised. Otherwise, the first shower, they would have figured out he wasn't one of the regular guys. So Uncle Alex lasted about maybe 14 months until they figured out that he was a Jew, and they sent him to a concentration camp, which he survived.
Wow.
So I learned his story over the course of my life in chats with him. He was a jolly old guy after the war. He wasn't one of those embittered, you know, he was
that's good.
Tough. But when he died, the family found taped behind his toilet tank in his flat an envelope with 5 photographs of himself in Luftwaffe regalia that he had never wanted to show to anyone.
Understandably.
And the whole thing sort of inspired the idea of this story, you know, this young 19-year-old kid. Okay, so that's that story, and I'm not going to do spoilers and stuff.
I'm looking forward to reading it, because in prep for the interview, I was like, oh, I need to double check, like, what else has he written? Get the synopsis so I know what's going on. I'm like, oh, this sounds incredible. So I'm looking forward to reading that one next.
I think you might enjoy it, and it's of a certain literary style that you'll appreciate. It's actually sort of it's written in the first person, which I had never tried before.
Oh.
As his diary as an old man.
Ooh.
He goes back and he tells this story. So at the end of this book, I can't reveal exactly what happens at the end because it'll give it away, but at the end of The Soul of a Thief, suddenly in my mind, these characters encounter these 7 British Jewish commandos right after the D-Day invasion. And those characters took the stage for the last of the 7. And then that book was based on all true history of the Special Interrogation Group, X-Troop, the True North African Campaign, what happened after the Sicilian invasion, you know, where these fellows would have been, what missions they then were rolled into, and you've read the book, so you know what happens and where they wind up. And all of that was a lot of heavy research. And then, as we were discussing before, I pretty much never write about someplace I haven't been. So I've been in North Africa a number of times. I spent about a month in Sicily working on the center part of that book. I actually stayed in that monastery. They have a little B&B.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, I actually stayed there. So all of that writing is really coming from, you know, exactly what we were talking about. You have to smell it, feel it.
Mm-hmm.
And I've spent a lot of time in Germany and so forth. So that was the sort of the impetus to writing that novel about those men they were real guys. And a lot of the people, now, of course, I create fictional characters
Yeah.
melding, as we all do. You know, you take
Mm-hmm.
somebody you know and you pull their personality into somebody who's historical or whatever. But the historical aspects of that book are all true.
Mm-hmm. It was a brilliant read. I had so much fun. The rule I generally have is like, I want to see the first 10 pages is like the test. Can this interest me within that much time? From the very first line, I wrote it down because I loved it so much. In the Sahara, the sun could make a man bleed. Like, instantly, I was hooked. And I love the way that you pace it. It's really great where we go from action at the right moments to then have the pauses where we actually have character developments that's just absolutely phenomenal. All the stuff in Sicily, I adored it. It was amazing. And then again, you have a great pacing for the way the book works. So
thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
I really enjoyed it. And
that's hard work, you know, to pace that. As you know, to pace something properly is not easy.
no, I mean, that's part of what I was so impressed at, because I read lots of books on structure because I obsess over stories. So of course I read all the books on it.
Right.
But the reality is, there's no like perfect way to do it. There's no, as much as people say, oh, you need like the 25% mark, the 50% mark, and the 75% mark. All those are just arbitrary general rules of thumb.
Yes.
Being able to actually set up a narrative so that it hooks a reader, gets them moving, gets the right pacing for exposition, for character development, it is not easy. And I was, again, just impressed with, it's phenomenal. Like, again, I enjoyed reading. I picked the date that we were doing our interview, and I was trying to make sure I finished it up around that time. I had to make effort to stop reading it every so many pages so that I made sure I was ending it around the time we were starting this. Because otherwise, this is a book I would have blown through within a day, 2 days.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that so much. I really do. I really do. You know what it's like to sweat over a narrative for a couple of years and wonder, is this any good?
Yeah, especially by the time second draft, third draft, you're like, what am I doing? I'm writing myself in circles.
30th draft?
Oh, I don't want to think about that. That's just
that opening of that book, I wrote it about 35 times.
And when I say I believe that, it's because it is that good, where it is as tight as a drum. You have like 2 pages of someone walking through the desert, and it is riveting. That is good writing.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I did a lot of walking through the desert, so I know what I'm talking about. And I actually did bleed from the sun. That's true.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh,
that is true. And I'll tell you that story. I've told that to a few people. And that's what inspired that opening line. When I was a young paratrooper, we used to do what they called stretcher drills, or long marches.
Mm-hmm.
To earn your red beret, you had to walk about 85 kilometers in the Judean desert and uphill to Jerusalem. So that took about 20 or something hours. I'll make a long story short. At the end of that march, when we were carrying all our combat gear and our weapons and grenades and machine guns, and it was July, and this is in the Middle East, so it's 90, 100 degrees, the sun is baking you. We were doing our last climb up that hill. At that point, the machine gunner had already passed out. We were carrying him. It was the Far Legion, basically.
Mm-hmm.
And the sun had fried the skin on my face below my eyes, like chicken skin, like fried chicken.
Yeah.
And as we were climbing that hill, somebody, as young paratroopers will do, cracked a bitter joke. I laughed, and a friend of mine said, "Steve, I think you're weeping blood," and it was from the cracked skin around the side of the eyes, and the blood was coming down from my cheek, and that's where I got that line. In the sun, in the Sahara, the sun could make a man bleed.
Wow. See, again, this is where those life experiences make for such, because that's a story that created a line, and it's an amazing line that starts the story. I have a question that I wanted to ask you about as far as writing historical fiction, because it always seems like, to me, historical fiction is intimidating because you are trying to construct a narrative within the bounds of known historical fact. What is that process like for you?
Yeah, that is, it's difficult in that, well, you know that historical fiction is exactly what you've described, whereas nowadays, the sort of historical fiction used to be the classic Michener kind of fiction, or Leon Uris, or and which is where I learned historical fiction, which is that you take the tapestry of true events, and you simply insert fictional characters to walk through the truth. Now, they should mirror the language of the time, the dress of the time, and whatever, and they may interact with true historical figures, although that's very difficult. I did that a couple of times in that book. We won't blow the surprise, but
I did love those moments, though, just so you know.
You have to do them very carefully, and they have to be true to form for the historical characters. And you can't, it's sort of like Forrest Gump, where Forrest shows up and Lyndon Johnson is chin wagging with him, sort of thing. And that's funny, but in my case, yeah. The history becomes the backdrop that gives the entire thing verisimilitude. But your characters have to be true to the events, the emotions, the language of the time. And if you're lucky, you have known someone who was in fact plugged into that time. And I did. I've met these people. In The Soul of a Thief, I had my uncle to talk to me about this stuff. For The Last of the Seven, I knew some of these old warriors who were still alive and very much alive when I was in the service, and they were veterans of World War II and of these, wild airfield raids and so forth. So it becomes easy for me. I don't think I would try this with, I'm sort of restricted in what I can write about by my own experience. I don't think I would try to do historical fiction about a hospital, for instance, and the doctors and nurses there. I would feel like a fraud. I would never be able to relate to that. But if it's about, a pilot or a parachutist or a merchant seaman or you know what I'm saying? If it's within my own experience, I can make it feel very, very real. So that's what I do.
Within the stages that you have kind of the mental models for to work with.
Exactly. Now, if I really wanted to write about farming, I could go off and work on a farm for a few months and pull it off. But it's not organic to me.
Yeah. I think the thing that, again, works so well to this is not only your writing style, but we touched on language. Every time an era has their own language. In this case, these characters are working with 3 different languages.
Right.
And I know enough of each of those languages, not much, but a bit smattering here and there. I think you did a great job judiciously mixing them in when you did and providing explanations on the words that you needed to.
Yeah, that's another, now we're getting into the weeds of which is fun for me. We're getting into the weeds of technical writing, and of course I don't mean writing about computer manuals, but the technical writing aspect of how much, and early on in my career when I was writing espionage novels, I feel like I overused the foreign language thing. Some people like it a lot, but now it's more, I know how to be more judicious about it and to put it in when to remind the reader that hey, we're all speaking German here, but not to flood them with translations. And it takes quite a number of years to get the right feel for that, I think. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. Well, and again, what I think works for the way that you have it structured in the story is essentially when it's almost like a transition marker. So like in a film, when you need to delineate between two different times, you have characters will have longer hair or shorter hair. You use like starting with some German to delineate that we've moved to now they're all speaking German for reasons for the story. And then they're good earmarks for the reader to know when we've shifted. And it's like it lets your brain do that thing where you watch The Hunt for Red October is the best version of this I've seen, where it intros, you see the submarine and everyone's speaking in Russian. And then as you're zooming in, it's all of a sudden just switches to English.
Yes, absolutely.
That is essentially what you've been able to do with this, where you have the German words thrown in usually in the story, which again, I appreciate because it makes the world feel more real.
It does, and you can't overdo it. And usually, technique-wise, if the group, let's say these commandos, are all alone by themselves in their barracks, and then somebody says, for example, boys, you got to speak German around here. You got to keep your German up, let's just say. And he says that in German. And we translate it. You know, we've got to speak German. You have to keep your practice up. And then you'll understand that they're speaking German for the rest of this. And then I will tag the end of it with genug, enough. So you then you really understand this was all German.
It's nicely bookended.
It doesn't have to be in German.
Yeah. And I appreciate it because language is, I'm not a huge fantasy nerd by any stretch. I can't make it through Tolkien. Bless his heart. Beautiful world. Love the whole consistency of language. But the one thing I really appreciate that he talks about in terms of what makes crafting a story work is having the consistency of a language. And I think that that's still true when it comes to real life and writing real life, because everyone approaches the world with a slightly different, a different set of words, a different dictionary. And that's where it's interesting when you see different characters from different parts and different areas interacting with each other, is that they have a different vocabulary that they approach the situations in life with. Everyone actually sounds different instead of just, oh, copy and paste number 5.
Exactly. That's why AI writing is never going to work for me. It's never going to work for me. I'm waiting for the day when somebody can show me a piece of AI written material and I won't know that that's what it is.
I haven't looked at any of this stuff. It makes me sad, honestly, because again, so my background, I'll rant about this for just a minute, then we'll move on. I have a background in food, organic agriculture. So I have a healthy appreciation for what it means to take time to raise something that isn't considered necessarily just a commodity.
Right.
This is a grass-fed organic steak. It's this breed of cow. It's all these things. It's not just a slab of meat. I feel like art is easily commoditized today. And that's when AI art, AI writing, all of those things become more prevalent. The more we take away any uniqueness it has, the more we say, oh, as long as it's just another piece of content to throw into the machine.
I totally agree. I mean, you know, one could argue that the whole publishing world has unfortunately encouraged a lot of this, where the appreciation for the hard work of writing, which is actually sculpting, that's how I think of it. I mean, I still write by hand the first drafts, and not everyone. I don't always do that because I do ghostwriting for some celebrities once in a while, and that I'll hammer away on a computer. Not that I don't respect it, but I don't feel like I need to be that quite as exacting about it. But you know, when you regard your writing as a form of art, then just dashing it off and getting it out there on the net for a 99-cent sale is not, you know, it encourages a lot of volume of lesser quality stuff, and AI is going to fit right perfectly into that.
I mean, that's the tragic thing. Like I said, I've read a handful of stuff where I was like, oh, cool. So they're trying to write this like spy thriller heist story. Sure. That sounds like right up my alley. I'll give it a read. And within 2 pages, I'm like, I can't do this. I just can't. Like, just because anyone can publish something does not mean everyone should publish something.
Well, everybody's got to have a book now. So, and you know, there's nothing wrong with people being able to self-publish. I know some big publishers, big writers who are doing self-publishing and doing very, very well because they're tired of dealing with you know, the trials and tribulations of the big five in the publishing world. And believe me, I get that. There's nothing wrong with, you know, taking on the business yourself and doing that aspect of it, and not giving 88% to, you know, to a big publisher who's no longer going to market you at all. You've got to do it yourself. So I get that. But on the other hand, it does attract a lot of sort of, I don't want to say lesser talent, but folks who more than anything want to see their name on the book cover and don't really care about the content.
Yeah.
But that's okay. The rest of us have to sweat more.
You know what? I have the firm belief that time is the great equalizer. Good stuff is remembered. And I want to ask you more about your a little more technical stuff on writing, but I just want to add, because again, people get The Last of Seven. It's an amazing book. When I read this book, my first thought was, this is a book I firmly believe will be around in 50 years and people will still be buying it.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I won't be around to see that, but I'll tell my kids.
It has a timeless quality to it. And that, I think, isn't something that's too... I don't think that, especially with historical fiction, like I love, what's his name? Arthur Conan Doyle.
Yes.
Love his books. His historical fiction has aged the worst by comparison to anything else he's written.
Yes.
I think that too often it feels like whatever is written historical fiction reflects more of the times that it was written than it does the actual era. Whereas I think that this one feels very true to the time and the era. If you had told me, took off all the details in this book, put it right on the line with Farewell to Arms, I would have just gone, oh, obviously these were all written roughly around the same time.
Wow.
So,
wow.
I
appreciate that.
That is high praise for me to really enjoy a book, because when I don't like a book, I complain about it a lot. So thank you. Kudos.
Do you complain about it directly to the author? I somehow doubt it.
No, haven't done that yet, at least. I wanted to also ask, so writing routine. Do you have a writing routine? And if so, what does it look like?
Yeah, I do, actually. And I start late, finish late. It takes me, I'm not one of those guys who gets up early, or gals who gets up early in the morning and starts writing at 7 o'clock. That's not for me. That I have to do what I call a lot of cooking before I sit down to write.
Yes.
So by the time I get to my desk and start writing, it's usually afternoon at some point, and I can write good work for 4 or 5 hours maybe, and then I'm done. But I'm consistent. And sometimes I write too many days without resting in between, which I don't think is great either. And I'm sure I go through the same thing that all other writers go through, which is when I can't just figure something out, I figure it out in the shower, and I'm going, oh, and there's no place to write it down, you know. Same sort of thing. I, in terms of writing discipline, have you read Pressfield's stuff?
I have. The War of Art is just a phenomenal read. I probably go through it at least once a year.
Oh, and it takes you 4 hours. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
and it's brilliant. And no one has ever captured the struggle the way Stephen Pressfield does. And I know him. I've discussed this with him, and
When I saw he had a quote on the book, I was like, okay, I know I'm in for a good ride.
yeah, he's a very generous guy too, but he's also brilliant. And his books about writing, his other books too,
Mm-hmm.
but his books about writing and the struggle that all artists, it's not just about writers, it's about artists in general, and you know, the resistance, he calls it, that
Mm-hmm.
keeps them from sitting down. And what's that book he said? Put your ass in the
Put
chair.
your put your ass where you want your heart to be, or something like
Exactly.
that. Yeah, I read it earlier this year.
Yeah, and and he's just has another book out, which I just got, and I'm going to get him to sign it for me. Government Cheese, which is about his
Yes,
struggle.
I read it 2 months ago. Good book.
Oh, was it good?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I so admire somebody like Steve and other writers like that. They get up into these ages where I don't want to say they don't care anymore, but they have no one left to impress. And they
Yeah.
just tell you what it is that worked for them. And you look at their body of work and you go, okay, if that's working for him,
Well,
right?
and that's what I love is there is that subtle delineation. I think that guys that have achieved a true mastery of the craft, they say this is what I do and this is what works for me.
Right.
It isn't necessarily guaranteed that's going to work for someone else, but this is what worked for me. And what I appreciate about especially Pressfield is his main thing is, guess what? You actually need to write if you want to be
Yes.
a writer.
Yes. Yes. You can't just talk about it on Twitter. You actually have to sit down and bleed on the page. You do.
Mm-hmm.
And those days, I don't know about you, I have days where I feel like what I've written is brilliant, and days where I feel like, okay, that was really trash, but I'll
I
fix it
think
later.
the painful part is when I feel like it's the stuff I slave over the most that in hindsight, I'm like, this is garbage. But it's the thing that I will dash out and like, oh, I've only got 10 minutes, but I have it, just write it down and it's there.
It's so common.
It's
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 so common.
writing.
It's writing. It's so common. I mean, I will slave over a page. And now I'm at the point where if I know it's wrong, if I know what
Mm-hmm.
I've written is wrong, but the kernel of
Mm-hmm.
the plot, that's the right place where it has to go, but the
Yeah.
writing is wrong. I now have gotten to the place in my career where I have enough faith in myself to know I can fix it.
Yep.
And my wonderful wife always says to me, Leah, I'll come down the stairs and say, that was trash. She says, you'll fix it.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I can fix it. So I'm sort of out of the woods that way. Whereas when I was younger and
Mm-hmm.
right now, I have no idea how to fix this. So
It's
look forward to
almost
old age.
like Winston Churchill had a quote where a book is like a monster that you must defeat, slay, and then throw to the public.
Yes.
And I love that quote because I love the comparison of thinking of it as each book is its own type of conflict. And with that, the more that you do it, even though it changes the issues, the problems, the things that work and don't work might adjust and change a little bit. At the end of the day, you have developed the experience and the tools, kind of like we were talking about with the adventures. Once you know that you can endure uncertainty, it makes it easier when you go back and do it again.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But you know, the other thing about Pressfield is, as we both know from reading it, is that no matter, and a lot of writers do not understand this. A lot of writers think they await the muse.
Yes. This
They
is
await
a
the
thing
muse.
that I have used in my next book, is a whole bit on this.
I can't wait to read that because they await the muse, and then well, it hasn't struck me yet today, and I don't know, the muse hasn't spoken to me, so I'm not going to write this chapter. I'll go do something else, which of course is part of the resistance that they're having, that experience. But you can't await the muse. You have to sit your butt in the chair and just, write nonsense.
Yeah.
Throw it away, write it again, throw it away, scratch it out, and then go, oh, that's pretty good. And before you know it, 4 hours have gone, and you've worked for the day, and you've got another 800 words. Okay.
Yeah. And like you said, sculpting, even if it's garbage thrown on the page, but that there's that thing that it could be only one paragraph out of a whole page that's got the thing that works. You can craft, sculpt, and shift around.
Yes, absolutely.
And that's part of the glory of writing. I love how books are written in editing more often than not. And from what I've read of other writers, and at least for myself, as much as I can have that initial idea and put the thing, that first draft is always going to be garbage. And once I got over the resistance of, but the first draft has to look really good. No, it doesn't. The point is getting it done so you can move on to the second draft, so you can move on to the third draft, so you can get up to the draft where it has been refined and just sharpened to the best point that it can be.
That's right. And how do you know, Terrence, when it's the best point it can be?
I have to give the problem is I'm a bit of a perfectionist in the sense I will overwrought myself over it. Once I start pulling the threads and I'm pulling apart the good stuff, that's when I know I have looked at this too much. And that's when I send it to my external editor and say, can you look over it? And then I'll make changes from there. How about you? Do you have your flashing light that eventually tells you?
Yes, I do. It comes from my publisher when the phone rings and he says, okay, that's enough.
But that's part of the joy. We don't talk much about writing isn't often seen as a collaborative medium, but I think that some of the best writing comes out of the fact that you work with other people that can help not regulate, but at least have another voice in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. There are many voices in my process. I try to deliver to all my publishers, and I've been fairly successful at this. I have sort of this inward mantra that if they have to work on more than 5% of my narrative, I haven't delivered a good piece. So I can't remember the last time I got a book back that had a ton of redlining and changes in it. They're usually fairly minor, and they're often very professional and very helpful. Like my current editor at Hanover Square, Peter Joseph, his comments to me are always spot on, and they're always very polite. It's not like, oh, this is trash, you got to change this. He'll say, do you really think that this wording is strong here because it implies something else to me? And I'll look at it and go, no, he's right. And then we were talking about language. I never rely on my own research to completely. I know enough German to write the German. I know enough, whatever it is, Hebrew, French, whatever it is, Italian. I know enough, but then I hire people who really know. So that book went past German editor, an Italian checker, and for the most part, a British editor to make sure. Oh, yeah. This is a British-centric book, and all of that language had to be accurate. And I'm pretty good at that stuff. See, a lot of that comes from the theater background. I'm pretty good with all this language stuff. But somebody's always going to find something and say no. A Scot wouldn't say that, not in 1940. And it's great.
Yeah. I remember my favorite story of something being caught once it's published. Ian Fleming, the estate came out with letters, the James Bond letters, basically all the Ian Fleming's James Bond letters.
Yes.
And one of them, someone wrote him about, multiple people apparently, that he had picked the wrong type of braking system for the Orient Express. And his replies of just being, thank you so much for bringing this to my attention. I try to be factual, but you know what? We missed this one. Thank you so much. I'm like, wow, what the picture of being gracious in the mistake post. But that's just my favorite story of the people will catch just the minor things like that. Someone will make that their hobby horse.
This is ringing such bells for me. Although I wasn't able to reply to this person, and I can't remember why, or maybe I did. I usually thank them. In one of my espionage novels, in which I had an event that transpired in the Punjab or something, and I had researched it very, very carefully, and I got a letter from India, and the person said, no, there were 2 women, not 1 suicide bomber. And I'm like, oh. Okay. And then after The Soul of a Thief, which I researched down to the last little thing, I get a letter from a guy who says, that particular locomotive is a 1939 Belgian cab and did not have a cowcatcher. And you go, why?
Yeah.
But okay.
Precious details like that.
Okay, that's why you got to research down to, I mean, you never say, well, close enough.
Mm-hmm.
Close enough. So,
Steven, this has been an absolutely delightful conversation. Where can people go to learn more about you, your work, and get their copy of The Last of the Seven?
well, Terrence, first of all, thank you very much. You're very gracious. And I have a site, stevenhartov.com. So you can find pretty much everything about what I've written before and what I'm writing now right there, or where I'm appearing. I do, book appearances and so forth. StevenHartov.com, and Amazon, of course, is the easiest place to pick up a copy of The Last of the Seven. And so thank you very much. I really appreciate the time.
Absolutely. And we'll link all of that in the show notes below. I'll also call out, you have one of the better author websites that I've seen. So
oh,
good job on that.
Thank you, sir.
It's always a pleasure.